We're going to look at Chapter 1, Network and Security Concepts. And there's an awful lot of networking. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to look at the most relevant and the most common networking portions. I probably will, at a later stage, do a second session on networks. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to move onto my whiteboard, and we're going to look at some of the most relevant network components. And the first thing we're going to start with, because it's the most heavily tested, is we're going to start with a device called a switch. Now, what happens with a switch? It connects internal users. So if you've got someone who's in the office over here, by the way, Art was never my forte, they have an Ethernet cable that they plug into the wall. This goes over the ceiling under the floors, and it comes into the switch panel, connects it, switch. So for instance, if I had a training room with 12 students, they'd all be connected to the same switch. So the main thing about a switch, it connects internal users, and it's extremely heavily tested. Please take a picture if you want. So what we need to do, we need to look at where this switch sits with the OSI reference model. Now, this is different to the real world, because if I look at the OSI, you've got layer 2, and you've got layer 3, and you've got layer 7, and these 3 layers are the most relevant for the Security+ exam. Layer 7 is the application layer. Layer 3 is the network layer. And layer 2 is the data link layer. Now, at this moment in time, the data link layer works on a MAC address. The network layer works on an IP address. And for the CompTIA Security+ exam, all switches are layer 2 switches. I know at the moment, when people are in the office, you're working on a layer 3 switch, but they're working on a layer 2. Networks are joined together with router, and they use IP, and they're layer 3. And layer 7, you're going to find a network intrusion prevention system and a web application firewall. They're the main devices that the Security+ exam has working at layer 7. So what we're going to do today, we're going to look at switch, and a switch is working on a MAC address, and it's working at layer 2. I'll now move on to a switch. Now, if I take the switch itself, the switch has got a number of ports. Let's pretend that's port 1, that's port 2, and that's port 3. Over here, I've got 4, 5, and 6. Normally, you've got 12 port, 24 port switches. And the switch allows internal users to connect together. So the first thing we're going to look at a switch, we're going to look at what is known as a managed switch. And that manages the connections. You'll see it as 802.1x. So how does this manage the connections? So first of all, we're going to have a good guy who's in blue, and he is allowed to connect to the switch. Then what we're going to have in red, we're going to have a bad guy who's not allowed to connect to the switch. Now, a managed switch, what does he do? he authenticates users and devices. Now, the good guy here has got a certificate that's known as an X509. So what he does, he takes a connection to go to port 3. And the switch looks at the certificate on his desktop, and it allows him to make a connection to the switch. So the bad guy is watching him, and let's say he goes to lunch. So we'll call this one A, and we'll call the bad guy, he's known as Big Bad Bob. Big Bad Bob's always the bad guy. So the guy from A disconnects to go to lunch. And what happens here? Big Bad Bob, that's a Zoom whiteboard for you. Big Bad Bob connects. But unlike the authorized user, he's not authorized. So the switch stops his connection. How's that? And that is a managed switch. So the next switch diagram we're going to look at, we're going to look at security on a switch. And here is my switch here. And here's a couple of ports, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. They're only academic, they're not real world. So there's two types in the Security+ exam. There's two types of users, and there's people with laptops. And let's say he's going to try and connect to the doctor's waiting room. Now, we're going to control the user access by a thing called port security. Now, what is port security? Let's say there's a doctor's waiting room, there's port number 1, and he wants to connect his Ethernet cable to there. Port security, the administrator turns the port off on the switch. So therefore, when he plugs in to the connection on the wall, it doesn't get connection. But on the Security+ exam, and we're at access points, access point. How does the Security+ exam affect those? It uses 802.1x. So how is that, ladies and gentlemen? Let's go and look at a third thing on a switch. Once again, the switch is connecting internal people. And I've got ports here, 1, 2, and 3, and a 4, a 5, and a 6. Now, in our network, we've got some people from HR, and we've got some people from IT, and then we've got others. And what we want to do, the whole company connect to the switch. Let's say this is a port. Let's say this switch has got 48 ports. We're only looking at 6 of those 48 ports. And I want to isolate the human resources from everybody else because they use a lot of sensitive information. An IT team does as well. So what we're going to create a virtual local area network. And this is known as a VLAN. So what we're doing inside the switch, we're using the software inside the switch to create a VLAN. So what we do here, we're going to mold the 3 ports 1, 2, 3, and we're going to call this HR, and this is going to be VLAN 1. We're going to go over here, and we're going to create and we're going to call this and 2. Now, when we've got a packet that's coming to the switch, it's got a source and destination. It's got the data on the end here, and it's got a tag. So each of these VLANs got a tag, and this says it's tag 1. So this packet is going to come along, and it's going to go to human resources. Now, the switch is heavily tested. I think of a VLAN as being segmentation, but I also think about it being departmental isolation, because what you're trying to do with a VLAN is take a department and keep it separate from other people on your network. How's that? So the next device I want to look at is I want to look at a firewall, because a firewall is heavily tested. And if we look at firewalls, we have a firewall over here, and his job is to block the traffic. So by default, he blocks the traffic. And then we need to allow exceptions. Now we'll call this over here the internet, and we'll call this over here the local area network. So therefore, if I've just put a firewall in and I want to get web traffic, I need to open up a port, which is an outbound port. Because it's outbound, it's going out. And I need to make it either HTTP or port 80. But if someone requests a web page, it doesn't work unless we create a corresponding inbound session. So this is inbound. And we also open up HTTP or port 80 as inbound. So one of the jobs of the firewall is to control traffic in and out of your network. So let's go and look at a couple of basic firewalls. Here we go. And we're going to call this the main firewall type. And the first one is host-based. So what I've got with host-based firewall, here is my Windows 10 desktop. And here is the firewall on my desktop. Now, when I've got the firewall on my desktop, it's protecting me from attacks. And then what you've got, another firewall that's heavily tested, is the web application firewall. And here we have over here a web server. And the web application firewall over here. And what is his job? He works at layer 7 of the OSI, and that is tested in today's test. And he protects the web server, and he protects the web applications. Then we'll look at another firewall, and he is called the stateful firewall. So here is the stateful firewall over here, and here is a packet that's going to arrive. At the moment, the packet looks like an HTTP packet. Now, the stateless firewall would just let the packet through if HTTP is allowed. But the stateful firewall looks at the packet, and it looks deep inside the packet. And if he's got get NFL.com, he will allow that traffic through. But if he's got the command post, which means you're going to deface, or head, which means you're going to banner grab, the stateful firewall will block both of those devices. How's that, ladies and gentlemen? It's a bit unusual because I've got no sound. I'm really sorry. I've got sound, but I can't hear you. So the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at a router. Now, a router is very easy for us to start because it connects networks. And if you think about it, this is me at home. And here is my broadband router. And you know from personal experience, should that router fail, then you get no internet. So the job of a router is to connect networks together. Now, let me look at what a router and a firewall have in common. So when you buy a router or you buy a firewall and you get it out of the box, these two devices have got a thing called an access control list. And it's not to be confused with a discretionary access control list. So whenever you get the device and you plug it in, the device has got a rule over here called deny all. So let's say, for instance, I had HTTP traffic coming in. We can see on our firewall or a router, there are no exceptions. So it will get the last rule, which is called deny all. And this is actually known as implicit deny. So what we need to do when we've got a firewall and a router, what these devices have in common, they're on the edge of your network. So let's go and look at what we can do. We need to put some allow rules in. So I'm going to allow HTTP, or I'm going to allow port 80. I could do another allow, which could be HTTPS, or it could be 443. Now, I've just bought myself a book, and it's been transferred from the web by file transfer protocol. So here's my book coming down through FTP, and FTP uses port 21. And you can see here that there is no allow rule. So what he gets the last rule, which is called implicit deny. How's that? Now what we're going to do, we're going to look at a couple of devices that are on your network. And the first thing we're going to look at is an intrusion prevention system. And he is known as an IPS. And he protects your network. Now, we're going to misuse this. We're going to call this an intrusion protection system. And we're going to use John Wick. John Wick's got a great big gun, and he's going to protect our network. And over here, we've got an intrusion detection system. An intrusion detection system is known as passive. And he will sit in the back of your network, and he has got a thing called a sensor, or another device called a collector. And he will look at the changes in traffic pattern. across your network. So let's go back and look at the IPS and look at the IDS. If we have got an IPS or an IDS and it's got an N on the front, that's network-based. If we have got an IPS or an IDS and they've got an H in the front, they're host-based. So the network-based devices cannot protect the host, and the host-based devices cannot protect the network. Now, we've got a couple of different setups for each of these, and one is known as signature-based. So we get updates, and one is called signature-based. And a signature-based update, it works on a database. Now, the problem you're going to get for this, you might update this 7 to 14 days. So it may not keep you up to date. And the other one is called anomaly-based. An anomaly-based, he starts off with a database like the signature-based, but he learns new variants. So he can keep more up to date than the other. Now, let's go back and look at a little bit of a network with the traffic coming in. Over here, I've got a router. And this brings in the traffic from other networks. Then I put on here a firewall. And if you think about it, if I've got John Wick, who's the NIPS protect my network, I don't want them at the back of the network. I want them at the front. So here's your NIPS, and he's protecting your network. Now, one thing you need to know, he is online, and that means the traffic flows through. The traffic flows through him. At the back of the network, over here, we've got the NIDS, and he's got his sensor, and he's got his collector, and he's looking at changes in patterns, or he's looking for new hosts. So it's pattern changes. Or he's also looking for a new host. So it may be a host that we don't want on the network. And he is known as passive. So your NIDS, your NIPS, your firewall, your router, and your switch are really, really heavily tested. But there's one other thing that I need to make you aware of, and that's a virtual private network. Let's go and look at a VPN. So here is a VPN. So, for instance, here's me here at home, and I want to go to online banking. I will have on my phone a VPN which will allow me to create a secure session. So let's look at basic VPNs. We're going to look at a VPN itself, and here is the VPN server, and this is my workplace. And I'm a salesperson, and I'm out and about. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to connect to the VPN server so I can get access to corporate resources. Now, in the exam, the tunneling protocol that's in the exam is called IPsec. And let's look at an IPsec packet. The first part of an IPsec packet is the authenticated header. And inside the authenticated header is SHA-1 and MD5. And they do integrity because they are actually hashing. And then over here is the ESP, and he's important. And he's the encapsulated security payload. He is basically the data. And the three protocols you use for this and A. Now, DES is a 56-bit key, triple DES is 168, and AES is 256. They're all, there's three of them. All three are symmetric encryption, which means they're using one key. So we need to create a tunnel, and we use a thing called Internet Key Exchange. And it uses a handshake called the Diffie-Hellman handshake. And this is in the exam, and it's known as tunnel mode. So you need to know three different modes for the VPN. Tunnel mode is external, because what they do, first of all, they make a secure tunnel, and then that data goes up and down that tunnel. So let's go and look at the other two modes that there is for a VPN. Oh, by the way, exam tip. If you want authentication, or if you want security of a VPN session, you will always pick encapsulated security payload, because although it's called the authenticated header, it does not authenticate. And this comes in the exam quite often. I want the authentication of a VPN packet. You need ESP. I need security of a VPN packet. You need ESP. Now, let's look at site-to-site VPN. Site-to-site VPN. Now, years ago, before we had broadband, I had site A. Let's say this is Texas. And let's say we've got site B, and we've got New York. Now, I could put in there a point-to-point connection called a lease line. And depending on the bandwidth of a lease line, I would have to get a lot of dollars out. But what happened to me after broadband was everywhere, we can replace, so a site-to-site VPN, this is a point-to-point connection. So let's go and make this a point-to-point VPN. So here's a VPN here, there's a VPN here, there's the first one here, there's the second one here, and we create the connection between the two. And this mode is called always on, because it's always on. So a site-to-site VPN, why do we use it? It's point-to-point. Now, recently in the exam, they started bringing up, and this is only in the last 3 or 4 weeks, they started picking up the description low latency. So if you need to do a VPN that's low latency, you will pick up a site-to-site VPN. Now let's look at the last one. So this time we're internal. And what the exam has been saying, I've got a server to a server. So the exam on 401 and 501, it's not been doing in 601, is connecting a VPN server to server. And this mode over here will be known as transport mode. How's that? Let's come out some of this. let's go into here.